John Carpenter's The Thing was not a massive hit when it landed in theaters on June 25th, 1982. In fact, it was actually kind of panned at the time, but years have been kind to the film, which is now held in high regard as one of the greatest American horror films ever made. Not surprisingly, this lofty status has made it one of the most discussed and debated horror films of all time, especially within the YouTube sphere. To avoid adding my unnecessary voice to the conversation, as well as my current reluctance to cover movies based on how much copyright bullshit Miramax is giving me for my Scream retrospective, I'll avoid covering the movie today. Instead, we're going to be covering the 2002 video game sequel to the film titled The Thing, not to be confused with the 2011 prequel to The Thing, also just titled The Thing. Sequel titles sure are something, ain't they? It was developed by Computer Artworks and published by Black Label Games and Konami for PC and consoles respectively. It began production in the year 2000, sparked by a now defunct video game branch of the film company Universal Pictures, Universal Interactive, after going through their company's IP backlog to see what they could shamelessly milk for adapt into a video game. The Thing had become a cult hit by that point in time, and when considering the popularity of horror video games at the time, making one based around the Carpenter flick wouldn't have been the worst idea. Universal invited UK studio Computer Artworks to pitch how they would make a proposed game, and the team put together a demo with reskinned assets from their previous game, Evolva. Universal was impressed and hired Computer Artworks then and there. According to Computer Artworks, Universal was fairly hands-off with the game too, and was open to letting them just run wild. So, rather than just adapt the film, they pitched a full-on sequel taking place very shortly after the Carpenter film's bleak, ambiguous ending. They cited Aliens, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and Half-Life all as influences on their direction. Said direction was far more ambitious and open-ended than the final game ended up being. For instance, the NPCs that the player would rescue and work with would all become the Thing randomly or after certain requirements were met, with it being possible for none of them to ever be infected by the game's ending. The game would also be closer to an open world experience, with non-linear progression for clearing the campaign being a possibility. Considering how monumentally difficult trying to make such a game would have been in a 2-year turnaround period, however, this was all scrapped. The scaled-back game was released in the summer of 2002, so a little over 20 years after its initial release. How does the Thing video game hold up? The Thing is very much a product of the early 2000s style of action games, a real fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants method of design for third-person shooters that ended once Resident Evil 4, and to a far lesser extent, Cold Fear, really solidified over-the-shoulder aiming as the norm. Also, since I'm probably never going to cover or discuss the game again in any capacity, let me do a little bit of self-correcting from past mistakes. Cold Fear was, in fact, not a Resident Evil 4 knockoff like I have previously said. The release dates are so close together that developers of Cold Fear wouldn't have had the time to take the over-the-shoulder aiming and repurpose it as their own. It's more likely that they just independently came up with a very similar style. So my bad, Cold Fear, should have done more research on that front. If nothing else, I do have to respect the Thing's ambition. Even in a heavily scaled back release, they still managed to develop a squad-based shooter where the player commands AI partners while having to maintain levels of trust as a mechanic. Arming them, doing the iconic blood test from the movie, managing their health and stress levels, or even coercing partners at gunpoint if all else fails. Not to mention how said partners can allegedly turn on you at any moment by being the Thing all along. Again, a highly ambitious game. Now, while this is all well and good, and could explain why the Thing received as much acclaim as it did around its launch, the actual execution of these ideas and smoke and mirror tricks done to create the illusion leave a lot to be desired. For my money, the Thing game doesn't work too well as an adaptation of the film, or as an action horror game on its own. The big elephant in the room is the game's AI, which, while lauded and admittedly more impressive than other action games with squad mechanics around the period it came out, is honestly a bit lacking in its execution. For instance, the entire trust mechanic the game really hammers in at the beginning is mostly irrelevant in practice. Most of your potential allies are treated as disposable assets, who you only need to trust you for as long as they're immediately useful. Even then, the only ones you really need are the engineers, who essentially act as walking keycards, disposable on use. Hell, most partner characters don't even make it past the level you find them in, whether they're assimilated by the thing or not. That's another issue too. The motif of the movie where anyone can possibly be an imposter essentially is non-existent here. While things like the blood tests are here in sort of like an I clapped reference capacity, mechanically they're largely useless for their stated purpose. Giving yourself the blood test in front of NPCs is used to gain their trust, sure, however it's just easier to do the same thing by giving them a gun and some ammo with how infrequently you come across those blood test kits. Trying to use a blood test kit on an NPC is also largely useless, since the game has NPCs become the thing at set intervals and trigger points, meaning that in theory you could get a negative result on a blood test, only for them to pop into a thing beast after walking past the trigger point almost immediately afterward. The trust system is largely a nitpick though. The real issue with the thing is the core gameplay itself, which is mostly just a subpar shooting gallery. You fight waves upon waves of enemies here, with one early game level being akin to a horde shooter like Serious Sam, almost. This is very odd for a slow-paced suspense story like the game's supposed to be based on, but not necessarily a deal breaker if done well. As you can imagine though, there are a lot of hang-ups. The game is heavily reliant on auto-aim for most of the general combat, which can be an issue for how up close the camera can get at times. When environments get tight and enemies get right up in your personal space, the auto-aim really stops cooperating. On the topic of auto-aim, I have to address the game's weird difficulty balancing. To my understanding, easy, medium, and hard all have the same resource drops as well as damage values given and taken, with the only difference being how forgiving the auto-aim is. All things considered, you may as well just play on easy if nothing else is different, just to make the flawed auto-aim at least somewhat more tolerable. Quickly touching on those damage values for a minute, wow is this game guilty of giving the player near unavoidable damage. From bosses that can get a hit in the split second a cutscene ends, to specific sequences such as the gun turret rooms and burning tower escape, the thing can be extremely cheap with what it often throws at the player. The thing does have a manual first-person aim, mind you, getting back to the combat, however it has its own share of issues. You're stationary while using it, and when paired with some of the more mobile enemy types, you can take some unnecessary damage to little fault of your own. Again, that unneeded damage issue. The worst instance is when the thing beasts decide to completely ignore a straight flamethrower blast to the face and sprint right into you. On top of that, the stick aiming is a bit too stiff and finicky for my taste, which makes precision aiming a bit more difficult than it should be. This becomes a massive pain in the ass once the hit-scanning soldier enemies are introduced. A game about horrible flesh monsters decides halfway through to make the new regular enemy type human soldiers, which is honestly kind of lame. It gets worse when you realize that cover combat really isn't a viable option due to the stationary first-person aiming and a lack of a full-on lean mechanic. The final level is especially egregious for this, with an obscene number of human soldiers being thrown at you. This sniper's nest right here may as well be the real final boss of the game, let me tell ya. The thing overall is just a really frustrating experience. The clunky controls and questionable design choices from the shooting galleries to the enemy encounters. On that basis alone, I really can't recommend the game, but it's also just disappointing that Computer Artworks took the John Carpenter movie and turned it into an action shoot-'em-up. As a sequel to the film, the Thing game also falls short. It makes the same mistakes a lot of horror sequels make, by trying to give the original the alien to aliens treatment by having military dudes show up and blow the unknowable horror away. Now, don't get me wrong, I like Aliens a lot. That movie kicks all sorts of ass. However, for every successful example of this, like Aliens, you get an unsuccessful example like, say, The Hills Have Eyes 2. And sadly, the Thing video game isn't too far off from the latter. The plot follows a US Army captain and Solid Snake impersonator Blake who finds Outpost 31 from the Carpenter flick. After visiting a greatest hits collection of scenery and moments from the movie, Blake discovers a grand military conspiracy to control and weaponize the Thing, and has to put a kibosh on all of it. Basically, it's just Weyland-Yutani and Colonial Marines. People are the real monsters because you don't see the things fuck each other over for a fucking percentage, you know the drill. Thing is, I really feel like this method of making a follow-up to the 1982 film really misses what made it so effective, and later on, such a beloved classic. See, the thing could never be properly contained, and its assimilation abilities means that if it reached any moderately populated area, it would become a true end-of-the-world scenario almost instantly. You don't weaponize the thing, you can't control or leash it. It was nothing short of a miracle that it crashed in Antarctica because it could have easily escaped anywhere else. However, for the film's characters, the Antarctic setting becomes a double-edged sword. Sure, the monster itself is essentially trapped, but by that same virtue, so is the entire crew of Outpost 31. Paired with its near-perfect assimilation abilities, and the storm keeping the crew locked in place with it, the situation is extremely dire. The real horror of the thing comes from the hopelessness of not knowing who is who with no help on the way, tensions rising, and resources dwindling as the cold begins to truly seep in. I don't mean to do another amateur hour film analysis, but I feel that it's really important to get across what the appeal of the Carpenter film is, at least in my opinion, because it's the exact opposite experience of the video game. To the game's credit, it does seem like there was an earnest attempt to replicate a lot of the iconography of the film, and it did do a decent job of creating a cold atmosphere with its wide open Antarctic landscapes. It kind of reminds me of how D2 on the Dreamcast looks, which is a visual style that's always appealed to me. The issue is making the core game a schlocky action shooter, however, which completely misses the appeal of such a bleak, self-contained film like John Carpenter's Thing. The Thing video game was made by people who respected the source material, and I'd never accuse Computer Artworks of phoning this one in, but at the end of the day, I don't think it works. It's a subpar third-person shooter with questionable mechanics and frustrating design, and a sequel that fails to recapture the magic of a classic horror movie that never needed a follow-up.